They actually see women's liberation as central to the entire political project. So it's no coincidence that a lot of people first hear about this movement by hearing stories or seeing images of women bravely kind of defending their communities or taking leadership roles in those communities. But it's true in economic terms as well, right? So they have a whole effort to build what they call the social economy, which is kind of what folks in the West often refer to these days as like a solidarity economy, right? So economy based not on private markets and profit and sort of exploitation of labor, but rather through just that, through workers' cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, sort of free and subsidized distribution of essential goods. Co-ops are kind of the main driving force of that, have a sweeping vision of social ecology. The domination of nature by human beings was seen as a reflection of the domination of human beings by human beings. The humanity's relationship to the natural world was a reflection of and a consequence of its form of social organization internally. Their vision is not just to carry out sort of climate energy transition and climate justice, right, towards renewable energy, but a sweeping social transformation that would upend all these forms of domination that I was just talking about, based on this practice of sort of ecological self-governance from at the community level. Their ability to implement this sweeping sociological vision is, of course, something that has to be reconciled with material reality on the ground. They would like to produce and have a lot of potential to produce solar energy.
We're in a funny, similar sort of situation in that some provinces are very reliant upon oil and gas.
Right.
But even in those cases where, like, actually, yes, there is the ability to do renewable energy, there is the ability to do all these things, we actually do have the capacity to it. You see roadblocks put up by the government, like, no, actually, we're going to effectively ban wind power in
right.
as much as we can in Alberta.
Right, right.
And it just feels like, on a level, one, it feels hypocritical because on the other side, you're talking about people who are actively in an actual physical conflict right now and are still willing to think about these things and consider these things. And two, it just feels very self-defeating on our part, given that we do have this capacity to actually go do a lot of these things, that we're not doing it, very much willingly not doing it. So,
right.
I mean, as much as you say it's a mixed thing, it sort of shocks me, I guess, a bit even now to think that, we're having conversations that are actually farther behind this, and we have the means to go do a lot of these things, and we're just choosing not to. Whether that's by a provincial government or federal government or whatever within Canada, we're just basically choosing not to do these things rather than actually not being constrained from doing them, right? Not a terribly good situation to be in. In our case in Canada, it's actually relying on exporting oil in a global economy where demand for that is going to drop pretty soon, and we're going to be like sitting there with basically a bunch of stranded assets, and our government. So you want to talk about like nationalism and the appearance versus the reality of actual self-determination. Our current defense strategy involves building American-owned oil projects, which is like a bit, you kind of go, well, what? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
This is a society of 4 or 5 million people who believe in the necessity to sort of like transition away from fossil fuels, but they're constrained by conditions, by political, economic, security conditions. And, there's an alternative world where the international society could have been providing diplomatic, economic support and other means of support to actually facilitate the process. More sort of egalitarian, democratic, communal societies are a lot more resilient to disaster. Another world really is possible. I saw it being built with my own eyes, and that's not to say that it was sort of this utopia that was flawless and everything was perfect and everything was transforming evenly. But what I saw was real living, breathing communities of real human beings with all their messy limitations as human beings, genuinely striving to find a new way and making major breakthroughs.
Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications with Sierra Club Canada, and today our podcast is with Arthur of the Emergency Committee for Rojava, or ECR, which aims to raise awareness of the autonomous region of northeast Syria known as Rojava, which they point to as an experiment in feminism, pluralism, democracy, and environmentalism from its beginnings that includes a sweeping vision of social ecology. We spend a lot of time on the Environment in Canada podcast talking about things like community solutions to environmental crises, specifically in Canada, things like giving communities more autonomy via renewable energy and mutual aid systems, and how organizing from the ground up can help Canada defend its sovereignty and environment. So for those of you interested in that sort of content, Rojava is a really important case study in those same sorts of things being carried out at scale. It also becomes apparent during the interview that when it comes to acting on climate change and adopting renewable energy, especially given upcoming demand decreases for oil and gas globally, there really is no excuse for us not to be taking action on these files here in Canada and helping others around the world do the same. And I'm just jumping back in here post the recording of this original podcast, which was on January 7th, 2026. To mention that a lot has happened in the region of northeast Syria since we recorded this podcast. It is now January 27th, 2026, as I record this. As we recorded this podcast, a conflict was escalating in the region with severe humanitarian consequences. And as a result, we have already recorded a follow-up episode. In fact, today we just finished recording it, and we hope to have that out very soon as a part 2 follow-up to this episode. So please do stay tuned. It might be out even as early as Thursday. And you can also find out more about what is going on through the ECR's website, which will be linked in the description. I'm going to forgo the normal introduction and jump straight into the interview. That said, you can find the Environment Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network or wherever you get your podcasts, and you can find out more about Sierra Club Canada at sierraclub.ca or on any of our social media channels. Arthur, thank you so much for joining me today. For those tuning in, who are you and what do you do?
I am a journalist and writer and activist who's also a member of this group, the Emergency Committee for Rojava. So I assume we'll be talking about what is Rojava, where is Rojava, but basically it's an autonomous region in northeast Syria that I spent some time in on the ground in 2022 and 2023. And in my work with ECR, I do a lot to try to sort of raise public awareness and sometimes sort of public support for the communities in Rojava and the broader Kurdish freedom movement.
What is the Emergency Committee for Rojava? What is Rojava itself? We had a little preamble before we started this where we were chatting about it. Again, I've had to generally explain this as the women you see on the news fighting ISIS in Syria, but who are we talking about here?
Right, exactly. So a lot of people, if they have any point of reference at all for Rojava or sort of the Kurdish movement in northeast Syria, it's just that. It's maybe around 2015, 16, 17, people were seeing a lot of stories and images of Kurdish women fighting ISIS. But what most people don't know a lot about is sort of what is the society that they were building in the background. And so the truth is that over the course of this very messy, complicated, chaotic Syrian civil war, which we won't dive into all the messy details of, there is a movement of basically what we should see as indigenous people, the Kurdish people. And the Kurdish people have their own language and culture and historic homeland that, because of just the unfolding of history and colonialism in the Middle East, have found themselves living within the borders of nation states such as Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, which don't really recognize their existence, let alone their right to sort of self-determination. Over the course of the Syrian civil war, the Kurdish majority communities in the north and east of the country basically established an autonomous zone, which, fast forwarding to today, encompasses almost a third of Syrian territory. We're talking about 4.5 million people, roughly, who are living in an area which is effectively not any longer governed under the control of the central Syrian state, but through this sort of new system of governance beyond the state, which this movement has been trying to build. They call it democratic confederalism. It's basically this idea that governance should not be a top-down institution, but rather should be something practiced by communities themselves from the bottom up,
Mhm.
from the local outward. I'm sure we'll have the chance to get into maybe a little bit more details of what that looks like. What is the system of democratic confederalism, as they call it in practice? But that's basically it. When people talk about Rojava, when people talk about the Rojava Revolution, they're referring to this autonomous region and the society that has been sort of built and defended over the last decade or more, primarily by the Kurdish freedom movement, but also by a whole sort of coalition of diverse peoples who also live in that region. So my organization, the Emergency Committee for Rojava, we're just an independent grassroots organization based here in the United States that's focused entirely on kind of raising awareness about Rojava, about communities there in northeast Syria, and the broader Kurdish movement in which they're situated. And we sometimes do things like, public events. I travel around giving talks. We host online events and study groups. But we also try to sort of not just raise awareness, but raise support in the form of grassroots advocacy. For example, doing our best to try to help people raise their voices and press the United States government to enact policies that would support the kind of safety and security and well-being of communities there in northeast Syria. I hope that gives a little bit of a sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's kind of interesting because we often have these chats within progressive and environmentally conscious movement within Canada and communities in Canada about like community control and community autonomy and how do
Right,
citizens play a role in government. So it's interesting. But I don't think a lot of Canadians would have necessarily pictured that happening in northeast Syria, right? And
right,
that's a bad bias to have, but it's kind of the case, right?
right, exactly. And to be honest, when I first heard about the revolution in northeast Syria, I sort of had this gut instinct that sort of like, that sounds a little too good to be true. That sounds sort of fantastical. There's no way. And of course, like any real social revolution, the reality on the ground is very messy. It's full of contradictions. There's plenty of differences between sort of the movement's sweeping aspirations for social transformation and the reality on the ground. But nonetheless, it is very much true that millions of people are living in what we could sort of see as the world's largest autonomous zone in Rojava and are genuinely building, not just a sort of political movement or philosophy, but concrete institutions of community self-governance that they feel, and I think they make a compelling case, really represents a sort of systemic alternative to the forces of state domination and bureaucracy and state violence, capitalist exploitation, patriarchy. These are all things that the movement there talks about very forcefully. When I mentioned patriarchy, they actually see women's liberation as central to the entire political project. So it's no coincidence that a lot of people first hear about this movement by hearing stories or seeing images of women bravely kind of defending their communities or taking leadership roles in those communities. The Kurdish freedom movement itself kind of has this philosophy that sees patriarchy as actually the sort of original sin of human
Mm.
civilization. In other words, the one of the kind of leading philosophers of the Kurdish movement, a man named Abdullah Öcalan, he has this line that woman is the first colony. So in other words, they rather than seeing as many sort of revolutionary movements have in the past, seeing sort of women's freedom or addressing issues of patriarchy or male domination as sort of tertiary issue that's
Yeah.
secondary. After the revolution, we'll figure all that stuff out. They actually see it as central, not just to their analysis of what are the origins of our problems in society today that need to be overcome, but central to their practical organizing today. So, for example, when I describe this system of sort of bottom up governance, where, by the way, under this system, the neighborhood, what they call commune, a sort of community council at the level of a neighborhood or a local village, is the basic unit of government. It's run through open assemblies that neighbors attend, sort of volunteer committees that coordinate on addressing basic issues, even down at that elemental level of the neighborhood commune. Any position of political leadership, for example, when these different levels of councils elect sort of a council chair, it always has to be a co-chair, and one of them has to be a woman. And women's organizations, they form their own autonomous organizations that exist in parallel to broader organizations in civil society and in the administration. And they even have sort of systems of quotas and quorums and vetoes, whereby essentially if a community tries to make a decision about women without women, it is nullified. Women's autonomy is sort of institutionalized in a way that's unprecedented even in any Western so-called democracy. A lot of things are messy about this, situation, but this sort of institutionalization of women's autonomy is as real as it gets. Anybody who's spent time on the ground there will tell you there's a lot of shortcomings of this movement, but the women's liberation is absolutely real. It's undeniable when you spend time there.
I really find that interesting because you're right. It is an issue that tends to take a secondary or even tertiary thing. And in fact, I'm thinking even of like an area of Montreal that's very much set up around cooperatives, right? Like this entire part of Montreal is very cooperative based. But even there, I'm not aware of, and I like that part of Montreal. It's very cool. They're doing a lot of cool stuff. I'm not aware of that
Mm.
aspect of women's liberation taking as much of a
Sure.
core central role, even though I think it's very much represented through that. It's just not as much the underlying foundation, but that is interesting.
Right. Yeah, I think that it's safe to say that, on this issue, the Kurdish movement is very much sort of in the lead. And even you mentioned cooperatives, they see themselves as coming out of the socialist tradition, even though they have a very much sort of at this point a very kind of anti-statist interpretation of socialism. In other words, they believe that they can't really build a sort of socialistic egalitarian society without overcoming state domination as well, hence the kind of bottom-up governance. But it's true in economic terms as well, right? So they have a whole effort to build what they call the social economy, which is kind of what folks in the West often refer to these days as like a solidarity economy, right? So economy based not on private markets and profit and sort of exploitation of labor, but rather through just that, through workers' cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, sort of free and subsidized distribution of essential goods, massive efforts to sort of organize workers where there are, still sort of market relations between sort of employees and employers. And co-ops are kind of the main driving force of that. And even when it comes to the cooperatives, they have an entire wing of the what they call the autonomous administration that's dedicated to building what they call a women's economy. So there's a whole sort of women's autonomous cooperative sector where they're putting a lot of resources and efforts into building women's self-determination in economic terms through helping them sort of come together, maybe providing loans and training so that they can build, for example, cooperative businesses together. So.
Well, it is funny how like these sorts of almost leaps ahead can happen in places that a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think of. I was actually just recently back in Newfoundland, and there is a historical example there of fishermen, so should say fisher people, basically creating cooperatives.
Right.
And actually kind of trying to liberate themselves from an extremely oppressive economic system in these small outport towns, right? Which is not where you would expect that to take place. So I guess very much interesting that Rojava seems to stand for being more than a state, but for this movement. And you mentioned that that movement includes a sweeping vision of social ecology. And I'm wondering, what does that mean and what sort of things have been achieved as part of that?
Absolutely. So maybe for starters, we can kind of talk about what that means for them sort of in ideological terms. In other words, like what is their vision for society? What is their aspiration? And then maybe transition to like, what is it? What has their journey been like in trying to construct that in the middle of, very chaotic situation, in the middle of the Syrian civil war. So in philosophical terms, ideological terms, what you said is exactly right. They have a sweeping vision of social ecology. Social ecology being a particular sort of political philosophy that has its origins actually in a radical kind of social theorist named Murray Bookchin. Spent most of his life in Vermont in the US. He was a sort of long time anarchist thinker, later sort of moved on to what he called communalist politics. But fascinatingly, around the same time that the Kurdish freedom movement went through sort of period of critical self-reflection and ideological kind of transformation following the capture of their leader Abdullah Öcalan in the late 90s, early 2000s. Around that time, Öcalan was exposed to the work of Murray Bookchin. He was doing a lot of studying in prison, in a Turkish prison cell, and he got a copy of this book called The Ecology of Freedom by Murray Bookchin, I think translated into Turkish at the time. And it really had a profound impact on what became what the movement now calls the new paradigm, right? So their old paradigm was kind of this traditional, like Marxist, Leninist, statist approach to building socialism, kind of on par with historic national liberation movements. They were their movement was coming out of the 1970s and taking inspiration from movements in Vietnam and Cuba. In this period of coming up with sort of the new paradigm, that's when they came to this conclusion that indeed this approach to sort of trying to secede and create a nation state for the Kurdish people, which was the original goal of this movement, was a mistake. That in and of itself would just reproduce the dynamics of colonialism, and that the only way to truly kind of liberate their people and their homeland would be to profoundly democratize it from the bottom up. And in the writings of Murray Bookchin, they found a lot of inspiration. For Murray, he called his philosophy social ecology because he saw the ecological crisis as an inherently social crisis. Put another way, that humanity's relationship to the natural world, its relationship of domination and destruction and extraction and exploitation, which I think we can all agree we see taking place today. To him, this is not just something that was kind of happening as an accident of history or just because of like people's mentality. It was a symptom of a particular social system. In other words, the domination of nature by human beings was seen as a reflection of the domination of human beings by human beings. Mm-hmm. The humanity's relationship to the natural world was a reflection of and a consequence of its form of social organization internally. So therefore, he came to the conclusion that the only way to have a truly ecological society, or just to avoid the deepening ecological crisis that we're facing, is through radical social transformation that would have to include transformation beyond all forms of social domination, right? So moving beyond state domination to forms of kind of community self-governance, federated from the local outward, from the bottom upward, right? Moving beyond kind of capitalist economic exploitation to more cooperative, communitarian forms of economy. And of course, transcending all forms of social oppression, whether that's patriarchy or racism or other forms of systematic, bigotry that undergird sort of the differences in power in society. So the Kurdish movement really took this to heart and applied it to their own context. And in Rojava, when the kind of chaos of the Syrian civil war erupted, there was a power vacuum that emerged. The Syrian regime sort of was forced to kind of withdraw its forces from the Kurdish regions, which previously had been very much underdeveloped. And when that happened, these communities took kind of the inspiration of these ideas and put them into practice. So they immediately started, when the government left, in other words, they created their own government that was sort of an inverted image of the Syrian state, which, so whereas the Syrian state was this sort of like very much this violent pyramid where the Assad family ran a dictatorship and passed all the decisions and power from the top downwards, they tried immediately to kind of create these structures which are still alive today and they're still trying to develop today, of the communes and the village councils and things like this, whereby governance could be a bottom-up practice. So when it comes to ecology, on the ground, it's been messy. Their vision is not just to carry out sort of climate energy transition and climate justice, right, towards renewable energy, but a sweeping social transformation that would upend all these forms of domination that I was just talking about, based on this practice of sort of ecological self-governance from at the community level. But in practice, they're faced with a lot of extremely difficult circumstances. So, for one, the whole background of this region made ecological transformation difficult. I mean, there's really you can trace even the origins of the Syrian civil war itself to at least being influenced by a historic drought that took
Hmm.
place in the late aughts, which really was a primary driver of migration to cities in Damascus and elsewhere, which served to sort of escalate the uprisings, which then militarized into the civil war. So you could kind of trace it back to that. But even further, reasons that are not just a matter of environmental policy, but also reflective of colonization of Kurdish communities within Syria. The areas that are majority Kurdish in the north and east, historically for decades and decades, were intentionally deforested, reduced to monocrop agriculture in form of wheat production, and made dependent on oil production. And interestingly enough, these regions were sort of extraction zones that they produce wheat, but they would not have the technology
To refine it
to
locally.
refine it. And same with the oil.
Okay.
Um, and that is the context that leads up to this rupture where suddenly these communities are in charge of sort of desperately finding a way to defend themselves but also to govern themselves, and so their ability to implement this sweeping sociological vision is of course something that has to be reconciled with material reality on the ground. And to make things worse, the Turkish state, right, Turkey lies to the north of Syria directly. Turkey has its own long history of oppressing Kurdish people. Turkey did everything it could, including invading and occupying and outright attacking Rojava to sort of halt this project in its tracks. One of Turkey's tactics was what the movement kind of now calls ecocide, basically to burn crops, to cut down forests and olive groves, crucially to block the flow of water into Syria. Turkey controls dams that control the flows of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers into northeast Syria, which are not only the major source of water, but also indirectly the major source of electricity production.
Hmm.
So you see already in the way the context was set up that not only is climate and ecology kind of setting the scene, the environment and natural resources are very much being weaponized against the movement as well. So they have tried in practical ways to implement their vision. I think by far ecology has been sort of the least developed kind of pillar of their vision. But nonetheless, they've made systematic efforts at reforestation, diversification of agriculture, development of recycling programs, a lot of sort of popular education about just trying to raise awareness about, environmental consciousness. They would like to produce and have a lot of potential to produce solar energy, but the conditions of embargo and war and limited resources have made it such that they don't have the technology or the capital to develop at scale solar production. So paradoxically, this sort of social ecological revolutionary movement has been dependent on oil and oil revenue. They don't have
Hmm.
a lot of oil into, it's nothing like a place like Venezuela or anything like that. It's
Canada.
yeah, no, yeah, too.
Yeah.
Um, and so it's not so much that it's kind of a major interest of, say, like foreign states to control, but it's game changing for the communities on the ground. So it's allowed them to have independence of their own fuel, which has been crucial for not just for transportation, but for, cooking and heating and everything else. That's the infrastructure they have, and that's what they need to survive right now in the
Mm.
short term. But also revenue from that. They've been able to sort of sell that oil in various places informally and formally, and that revenue has been essential to their, sustaining themselves economically. So again, paradoxically, you have a community, a movement that is genuinely aspiring to move not just beyond capitalism and state power and patriarchy and all these things, but also move beyond sort of exploitative relationship to the natural world, to a regenerative ecological economy and society, they're nonetheless dependent on these things. So the progress on the ground has been, frankly, pretty limited and difficult and slow. And some of that is not just due to external factors. The external factors are very real. We mentioned some of them. The constraints of the war are very real. The need to use fuel to defend their communities. This is a movement that believes in the right to self-defense. And, I saw on the ground the very desperate need for self-defense when, civilian communities were being attacked by ISIS and by the Turkish state and by others. So that takes fuel. There's also other constraints. Drought climate itself is affecting their ability to produce to diversify agriculture, in other words, and to reforest. Water constraints weaponized by Turkey, as you can imagine, are also influencing that. Just general scarcity of resources. For most of the course of this civil war and revolution in the Northeast, Syria's been under embargo, which means, even if somebody wanted to give or lend large amounts of capital to develop solar energy production, there hasn't been a way to facilitate that. Some of that might be changing, but the situation on the ground is sort of volatile and complicated right now. But lastly, I would just say there are also sort of internal constraints, you could say, or subjective constraints. And the movement's very much aware of this. In other words, it's one thing for the kind of leadership of the movement to be trying to build sort of ecological institutions, even if to us they seem sort of like modest projects like recycling and planting trees, diversifying agriculture. They're limited also by just the general conditions of like the culture and mentality in society. So just general awareness of recycling, or renewable energy and fossil fuels and climate change. It's just not something that the average person has been very educated about, aware of. And it's been even harder to get people to think about sort of ecological transformation when they're being bombed, right? There's also just this competition for what feels like it should matter the most. This was true of COVID vaccines as well. There was a massive effort to get vaccines into Northeast Syria. They were being hoarded by the regime. And in some cases, communities were like, no, we're fine. Like, we made it this far. Like, it doesn't matter. Do something that matters. So anyway, I should sort of slow myself down. You probably have other questions.
Well, no, but I just want to chat about that a bit because it's funny. You're mentioning a bunch of things that more recently in Canada we're having conversations around. Part of this is, of course, that the US has become kind of aggressive to Canada. And I think as of yesterday was threatening Greenland with military incursion. So we've been dealing with this. But, Canada has a bunch more resources, a bunch more capability. We're in a funny, similar sort of situation in that some provinces are very reliant upon oil and gas.
Right.
But even in those cases where, actually, yes, there is the ability to do renewable energy, there is the ability to do all these things. We actually do have the capacity to it. You see roadblocks put up by the government, no, actually, we're going to effectively ban wind power in as much as we can in Alberta.
Right.
And it just feels like, on a level, one, it feels hypocritical because on the other side, you're talking about people who are actively in an actual physical conflict right now and are still willing to think about these things and consider these things. And two, it just feels very self-defeating on our part, given that we do have this capacity to actually go do a lot of these things, that we're not doing it very much willingly, not doing it. So, I mean, as much as you say it's a mixed thing, it sort of shocks me, I guess, a bit even now to think that, we're having conversations that are actually farther behind this, and we have the means to go do a lot of these things, and we're just choosing not to. Whether that's by a provincial government or federal government or whatever within Canada, we're just basically choosing not to do these things rather than actually not being constrained from doing them,
Right, exactly. And, to sort of reference back to the Kurdish movement's own analysis, these are systemic problems that are baked into the political and economic structures of power on a global scale. And you see that reflected all the way down to the constraints placed on local communities, even when they are genuinely aspiring to sort of find a way out. In other words, it's not just a matter of climate justice, to sort of put it simplistically, is not just a matter of like political will. You also have to have the power and the resources to build an alternative economy, an alternative society that isn't structured in that same way, and that requires capital, that requires support, that requires not being bombed all the time, and not all communities have that luxury. I mean, in some ways, while Rojava is very explicitly not trying to create an independent nation state, they're very much aspiring to what they call democratic autonomy. In other words, sort of functional self-determination within the existing nation state of Syria
Mm.
for their communities. At the same time, I think we can look at it in ways that are sort of analogous to the way, in the climate justice movement, we talk about sort of smaller nation states that are materially constrained in their ability to carry out a just transition or any kind of green transition. I would love to see the autonomous administration of Northeast Syria discussed in that same way. In other words, this is a society of 4 or 5 million people who believe in the necessity to sort of like transition away from fossil fuels, but they're constrained by conditions, by political, economic, security conditions. And there's an alternative world where the international society could have been providing diplomatic, economic support and other means of support to actually facilitate the process, but that's not the one that we live in.
Well, we're not even doing it ourselves, right? Like I always find
Of
it funny.
course,
There's a lot
yeah,
of
yeah.
headlines coming out about other countries. Vietnam just installed a bunch of wind power.
Right,
Pakistan's installing a bunch of solar, and not necessarily doing it for climate reasons, but just actually energy security reasons, right? Like
yeah,
relying on gas from some other country is not a terribly good situation to be in. In our case in Canada, it's actually relying on exporting oil in a global economy where demand for that is going to drop pretty soon, and we're
right,
going to be like sitting there with basically a bunch of stranded assets, and our government.
right,
So you want to talk about like nationalism and the appearance versus the reality of actual
right,
self-determination. Our current defense strategy involves building American-owned oil projects, which
right.
is like a bit, you kind of go, well, what? That doesn't make a lot of sense. But it's there is like that question of the larger international justice thing of with other nations, particularly smaller nations or smaller regions, making all these changes,
Yeah,
often with more limited resources, or at least wanting to, at least having a genuine interest in doing that. Why are we sitting back here and one, not doing it ourselves to the degree we should be, and two, then not providing any aid or real support to other countries and other places in order to do that?
right. Exactly. Exactly. I agree. Yeah.
You spent a year living in Rojava, and I'm curious if there's something you want people, our listeners, to know about that region, about the people living there, and about what's happening there. What would that be?
More than we could fit into a podcast, probably. But I honestly, as sort of simple as it may sound, the biggest takeaway I had from my entire experience was just that communities really can govern themselves, and that a new to to reference the old cliche, perhaps, another world really is possible. I saw it being built with my own eyes, and that's not to say that it was sort of this utopia that was flawless and everything was perfect and everything was transforming evenly. But what I saw was real living, breathing communities of real human beings with all their messy limitations as human beings, genuinely striving to find a new way to organize society and making major breakthroughs in developing alternative institutions that can actually make that possible. And seeing that with my own eyes, getting to sort of be immersed in it and participate in it in different ways and meet people and talk to them. I took it away not just as something that's possible in Northeast Syria, but as something that's just possible anywhere. You can't copy paste the sort of same strategies and tactics from movements halfway around the world in your own community. We all have to apply these things in our own context and adapt, ideas and practices for the time and place that we live. But in a larger sense, I think there's just this inspiring kind of underlying fundamental lesson that another way is possible. And I took that home with me in a major way. I saw also just how, kind of tying this to ecology and the conversation around the climate crisis. I also saw ways in which more sort of egalitarian, democratic, communal societies are a lot more resilient to disaster. Not just seeing how they adjusted to conditions of war, but for example, through this sort of theory and practice of democratic confederalism, they've been able to not only accommodate mass waves of refugees, and internally displaced people within Syria moving into their regions or around their regions, they've also been able to sort of empower those people to govern themselves where they end up living. So the refugee camps in Northeast Syria, for example, they're run through the same democratic confederalist system as any other town or village or city neighborhood. They're set up through communes, and they have councils, and they have committees, and they get together and have assemblies. I toured some of these camps and attended some of their meetings where people who are facing really desperate circumstances have been uprooted from their homes and had to move, hundreds of miles away. They don't know what's happening. They don't know how long they'll even be there, are quickly settling into practices of community self-governance, which I thought was incredibly inspiring. And I also saw in the Kurdish neighborhoods of Aleppo, which are sort of autonomous neighborhoods called Sheikh Massoud and Ashrafia. These are Kurdish neighborhoods that have maintained their autonomy kind of over the whole course of the civil war, incredibly, while being sort of blockaded on all sides. I traveled to Sheikh Massoud after Aleppo was hit by a major earthquake. Some people may remember in the early days of 2023, January or February. And I traveled there expecting to see the devastation of the earthquake. And I did see that, but I also saw this incredibly organized community that immediately knew, what families were affected, where shelter was available, how to coordinate logistics, how to coordinate aid, because the sort of baseline before that disaster hit was this high level of intimate community self-organization, right? So down to basically the block level, you had forms of organization, and you had organizers kind of playing a leadership role in their community that were tracking all of these things, that had relationships and trust and institutions that they could coordinate through, so that when some disaster hit, they immediately were able to respond and take care of their people in a way that states can't do, right? You can't sort of fake that from the top down. It's nice to have the resources of a state, but you see this sometimes in disaster relief efforts, right? Where, big NGOs or state agencies come into a disaster zone with trucks full of aid, and they don't know who to give it to or how to coordinate it efficiently, or what's even happening on the ground, who to trust, right? It's sort of just coming from the outside. And even with the best of intentions, there's limits, right? And in Rojava, I saw sort of this like extreme version of what in the West some people call like mutual aid disaster relief, right?
That's what I was thinking as you're talking about this. I'm like thinking of all my friends who call this mutual aid, right? Which I don't know if is that a good term for this, or does
I think it's own? I think it's what, if you take mutual aid sort of to its conclusion, it looks like something more holistic like this, right? Where it's not just a sort of decentralized response to disaster, it's the sustained self-organization of community self-governance that creates underlying resilience before and during and after a disaster. And I think that's something we can really aspire to. In other words, not just in thinking in the West, anywhere in the world, as we move into this period of deepening climate crisis and the broader sort of, again, social ecological crisis that is sort of tied to it and also escalating and compounding. And frankly unpredictable ways, I think we can take that as a serious lesson that we need to find our own ways of organizing our communities at the local level, building those kind of structures of solidarity and resilience and self-governance that can help us, not just weather those storms, but hopefully sort of build the basis for, again, something new, something fundamentally different that wouldn't produce this crisis in the first place.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we're seeing this in Canada every year now. Wildfires in Canada are getting worse. We're seeing like tens of thousands of people evacuated, often in smaller places where there's less kind of that upper level state support, right? That can immediately be deployed, and it is often people helping each other that's the difference. And as you say, setting up those, it's a good point, setting up those systems of mutual aid in advance and having them as a continuous thing, as opposed
Yeah.
to just a response to a crisis that happens as a one-off, and then
Right.
that's it, right? I think you mentioned this before our call, but I did just want to touch on it that currently Rojava, the people there, they are under a risk, right? As the situation in Syria has changed a lot. I didn't know if you had anything you wanted to mention to that.
Sure, and thanks for the chance to kind of reference it. I don't know how exactly when this episode will air, but we're recording it on Wednesday, the 7th of January, and the very latest news is that the new government in Damascus, right, the new sort of Syrian regime, the central government of Syria, is making moves to attack these Kurdish communities in Aleppo, the neighborhoods of Sheikh Massoud and Ashrafia. And this is happening in the context of unfortunate breakdown of process of peace negotiations. For those who don't know, about a year ago, the long-standing Syrian regime, the Assad regime, fell and was overthrown by a group called HTS, which comes out of its own sort of kind of right-wing Islamist jihadist tradition with roots in Al Qaeda. Historically, this is an organization that has attacked Kurdish people over the whole course of the Syrian civil war, but they now run the central Syrian government. And the head of HTS has even been invited by Trump to the White House and visited about a month or so ago. And so the Syrian Democratic Forces and the larger like autonomous administration in northeast Syria, the Kurdish-led movement that we've been discussing this whole time here, they are making an appeal to the new Syrian state to try to come to an agreement that in order to avoid any kind of conflict or war, they're simply asking that their self-determination be recognized, that they're not trying to create their own country. They see themselves as a part of Syria. They believe that all communities in Syria, diverse communities, diverse ethnic and religious communities, have the right to self-governance, to self-determination. They advocate that for all communities within Syria, not just in the territories kind of under the movement's current control. But that's really a contrasting vision to the new Syrian state, which is very much has a sort of top-down, anti-democratic, patriarchal mentality. I mean, you can go down the list of all the kind of pillars of the Kurdish freedom movement, and in some ways, unfortunately, their opposite can be found in the program and ideology of the new Syrian government. So we're all hoping that there can be some sort of negotiated settlement that recognizes a baseline of self-determination and can secure like a lasting peace in the region. But unfortunately, as of this morning, there's escalating attacks from the regime on these Kurdish neighborhoods. They appear like they're seeking to functionally ethnically cleanse these neighborhoods of the Kurdish population. There's already been a kind of mass exodus and some clashes taking place. So what I would ask is if people are inspired by the topics we've been discussing today, or interested to learn more about Rojava, about the Kurdish movement, about what's happening today in Syria, to check out our organization. Our website is defendrojava.org. That's the website of the Emergency Committee for Rojava. You can also find us on some social media platforms under the same sort of at Defend Rojava. And the reason I say this isn't just to promote our organization, but we are so as soon as I get off this call, trying to figure out kind of how to respond to the current situation. So I unfortunately, at the time of recording, I can't tell you definitively what people are going to find, but want to encourage people to go to the website and engage with what will probably be some form of a public statement that people could share to raise awareness about the situation, and possibly will include a sort of call-in campaign to try to sort of pressure the U.S. administration, as bleak as a prospect as that may sound these days, to advocate to use its relationship with the new Syrian state to push for Damascus to kind of back off and cease these attacks against the Kurds. A lot of people may not know, but to make this story even more complicated, the United States military and the U.S.-led sort of coalition against ISIS has had a tactical relationship with some of the sort of self-defense forces in Rojava who have been defending themselves from attacks by ISIS. And so there is a relationship there, even though it's a sort of cynical relationship in both directions, you could say. So our hope is that relationship could lead to a de-escalation. I wish I knew more about the sort of nitty-gritty details of the relationship between the Canadian government and the new Syrian state. But for those listeners in Canada, I assume most of the listeners are in Canada, would also encourage folks to raise awareness about this issue and maybe reach out to your own elected officials in Parliament to advocate any kind of practical solidarity with Kurdish communities and other minority communities under threat in the sort of new Syria. I'd also mention that there are Kurdish diaspora communities in Canada too. And particularly in Toronto, if there's listeners in Toronto, I believe there's like a Kurdish community center or cultural association there that people can probably check out and support. So encourage people not just to sort of look to us or take our word for it, but to, find Kurdish people in your community, get to know them, learn from them, and build what the movement calls this sort of civil diplomacy between peoples, not between states.
I actually really like that idea in so many ways. That speaks to a lot of conversations I've had on a number of issues. This idea that, people need to be talking to people, because at the end of the day, states tend to not do such a good job of that sometimes, and or actively undermine the ability of people to do that or try to. So, Arthur, thank you so much for joining me today. I don't want to keep you any longer because I know it sounds like you've got a lot to do, but thank you so much for joining me.
Connor, I really appreciate you reaching out, and I enjoyed the conversation. I'm here to chat anytime. People can also reach out to via email at info@defendrojava.org. If anybody has any burning questions or wants to sort of get more involved, feel free to email us. I check that email regularly. So let's all stay in touch, and wish you all wellness and solidarity.
Same to you. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM, bi-weekly on Tuesdays, 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.